It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. First of all, thank you so much, my dear Oliver and the rest of the faculty members for such a warm welcome to this beautiful university in the charming city of Passau. And as everybody told me, the best thing about Passau is getting the train to Munich, which is beautiful. So I'm not quite used to the cold weather, as you can see by my Latino looks, but it starts to grow on me, and with a generous amount of Glühwein and Schnapps, I'm sort of, I think I can handle it. So I come from the University of Porto. So I'm doing currently my PhD about immersive journalism, and it is a research that I try to approach not through the technological hyped lens, but hopefully through a more humanistic perspective. I have no experience as a journalist, only a very strong fascination for journalism and mostly a profound respect for the profession, given that my late father was one of those dinosaur journalists in my home country. Having said this, hopefully today I will try to provide you with a clear idea about the main concepts surrounding this phenomenon, but also some historical entanglements between journalism practices and visual media, and how they created those senses of immersion, presence and emotion without any sort of technological mediation. And finally, some brief conclusions and considerations surrounding this phenomenon. So let's get down to business. So today, as we know, journalism is interactive, interconnected, participatory, more open, more global, multi-platform, multi-linear, producing a constant stream of data, analysis, and comment. And people's everyday lives are correspondingly lived in rather than with media. So the challenge for the news industry is neither finding working business models nor figuring out what to do online. It is about becoming a meaningful, insightful, and trustworthy part of an emerging, effective media ecosystem profoundly influenced by technology. This sort of ubiquitous media ecosystem doesn't mean that people's lives are determined by technology, but certainly suggests that our understanding of society and the role of journalism in it must start with an appreciation of the profound mediatization of everyday life and the life world. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that people have an increasingly intimate relation with technology in general and media in particular. Several changes in media have contributed to people's increasingly personal and emotional engagement with the world around them. But it seems quite clear that the major shift is related to the fact that media are now predominantly mobile and profoundly personalized, as we all know. Our devices are always with us, so therefore the way we experience content is physically different. Content is with us anytime, any place, anywhere. In terms of news, what we are doing comes down to reading, watching, viewing, listening, checking, snacking, monitoring, scanning, searching, clicking, linking, sharing, liking, recommending, commenting, voting, and so on and so forth. And as humans, we love this. And as it becomes more personal and social, we become more attached, a sort of digital codependency. So technology and media are omnipresent in everyday life. Thus, journalism and news are now living alongside kittens, shopping, sport, music, online dating and mating rituals, pornography, and games. And at the heart of this, it can be argued, is emotion. And this, I believe, is also a key concept within immersive journalism. Emotion drives people's increasingly intimate relationships with technology, which therefore fuels engagement with news and information. So it necessarily becomes an important dynamic in how news are produced and consumed. Consequently, today journalists are driven towards using emotion as a tool. So Deuze and Beckett have identified three major factors for this. The first is economic. And in a digital media, I would say, overcharged environment, competition is everywhere and endless. People get distracted very easily. So getting their attention today inevitably needs to encompass emotion to create the experience of involvement with the news. The second factor is technology. And it is quite clear to all of us that using emotional cues helps to get people's attention to prolong their engagement. A story with emotionally engaging images gets more traffic. Text written in conversational language tends to increase responsiveness. Journalists now have not only to pitch and submit their stories, but also publish and publicize them across their networks and social media, as well as enhancing them with infographics, maps, timelines, and so on. The third and final factor is behavior. Today, journalists need to understand how people relate to the news on a personal, but also on, I would say, a communal level, to ultimately try to effectively connect people to their journalism. This is crucial because news consumption is now part of, as we know, social media, where people act in an emotionally charged way to connect with their community or wider networks. So in a nutshell, it is quite clear that the challenge for journalism is to foster the art of listening and collaborating, not just to promote consumption, but to empower the public to pay attention to news in an active, critical and self-reflective ways, grounded in what Hartley calls a multimedia literacy. And as emotion pervades this networked news ecosystem, we witness the emergence of new storytelling styles and formats that integrate substance and affect. So styles and formats that put the human factor at its center because the audience is now part of the process, and here is where we fit immersive journalism. So, and firstly, and we must understand and consider the technological scenario that led to the emergence of immersive journalism. So first things first, VR 101, what is virtual reality? So basically, as we all know, it's an experience that reproduces a real or an imagined environment, allowing users to interact with this environment in ways that feel as if they were actually there. For these experiences to happen, one must firstly create a virtual world, either by recording a real-life scene or by building an environment through CGI, through computer-generated imagery. Secondly, one requires a device like this, a head-mounted display or goggles, as you wish to call it, that allows users to immerse in these virtual worlds. But obviously VR is not something new, as we know, and it has been used for decades in technological experiences, and theory has also been written about its main concepts and implications. So why now? Why is it quite essential to study this phenomenon nowadays? We know that over the past, I would say, 6-7 years, a new VR ecosystem of companies and experiments emerged. And we could say that it all started with the development of the Oculus Rift headset in 2012, which was bought by Facebook in 2014 for mere pocket money, $2 billion. Since then, many other headsets have emerged, and virtual reality is rapidly turning into Silicon Valley's next gold rush, next El Dorado, I would say. The fact is that contents are evolving at the same pace as VR technologies, and VR seems to be on the crossover of mainstream adoption, which is obviously debatable, and a closer look at this through the eyes, for instance, of diffusion of innovation theories might help clarify. But the fact is that this tech revolution is powering mostly the entertainment industry, and in this emergent system, journalism is obviously still a minor cog, but starting to become a major player. So media outlets like the New York Times, BBC or Vice are now producing virtual reality news pieces, incorporating immersive journalism in their newsroom's workflow. So how can we define immersive journalism? So according to Noni de la Peña, whose name has been quoted more times than Gandhi within this research area, she's considered among both scholars and media professional as a godmother of immersive journalism. So immersive journalism is, and I quote, the production of news in a form in which people can gain first-person experiences of the events or situations described in news stories. In other words, immersive journalism allows its users an embodied experience of effective entrance in a virtual world that recreates the news stories or presents a 360-degree recorded scenario of a given news story. So it was Noni de la Peña's concept with this idea of the first-person experience of the news stories, as well as all of these VR/360-degree journalism experiments that actually triggered me to study the various ways, in particular, that people are responding to this phenomenon. So one could say that an immersive journalism/news story is related to this sensation of experiencing an alternative or an alternate reality, and this obviously encompasses two fundamental concepts: immersion and presence. And I would like to add a third one, which is emotion. So the first notion, immersion. So Whitmer and Singer describe immersion as the sensation of being involved, included, and or in interaction with a digital environment. Scholars like Slater and Wilbur, more aligned with the so-called technological determinism, propose that immersion should be considered as a product and an outcome of technology, that is to say, that immersion should be understood as means, and I quote, to which a computerized system is capable of offering to the user the illusion of reality at once being inclusive, vast, surrounding, and vivid. In other words, immersion is hereby defined as the sensation of experiencing an alternative reality that is objectively provided by virtual reality technologies. My take is that immersion can be defined as being fully involved in some activity or interest, digital or not. When I read a great book, I'm obviously immersed. When I'm completely absorbed by something to the extent that I feel, and feel here is key, that I cannot stop thinking about it, I am immersed. Furthermore, this is also to say that I believe that immersion does not require interactivity, and on the flip side, interactivity does not guarantee immersion. Rather, immersion requires the reader, watcher, or user to feel involved in the content, whatever format that content comes in. What I mean is that simply engaging a user's visual and auditory senses does not actually justify describing an experience as fully immersive, or as you want to call it, and obviously it does not excuse lack of narrative. Therefore, immersive media experiences should ideally incorporate what I call sensorial, cognitive, and emotional immersion. So, second notion, presence. So we might roughly define presence as the sensation of being there, basically. And Kim and Bioka suggests that presence assumes an almost instantaneous combination of the sense of departure from the immediate and physical world and of arrival to a virtual one. I argue that immersive media experiences encompass not only this departure-arrival dichotomy, but also comprehend presence in the way Heater proposed us, that is, personal presence, which, and I quote, corresponds to the feelings of being present in a virtual environment as well as to the reasons invoked by the individual to explain this phenomenon. So, third and last concept I would like to add to all of this shenanigan, emotion. So the sensation of being in a real place, reliving real stories with real bodies was, for instance, so recurring in Noni de la Peña's experiments that she called it response as if real. But what does this actually mean? I would suggest that the sensation of as if you were there is deeply related with emotional involvement. Hence, immersive media experiences are experiences in which people are emotionally involved in the stories, an affective involvement that is triggered by an effective and dynamic combination of the feelings of immersion and presence. So, bearing in mind the ideas of immersion, presence, and emotion, it can be said that an integrated reflection about immersive journalism should be based on a real operationalization of these and some other related concepts, obviously. However, immersion and presence are not exclusive or endogenous of virtual reality experiences. And in this regard, I find relevance in considering some journalistic practices that, although far from being related or generated by VR technologies, are relevant examples of creating a sensation of immersion in their stories, something that we might call narrative visualism, let's put it that way. So in other words, one of journalism's basic goals is that of creating an effective relation between the public and the news. Therefore, associating this relation to different forms of immersion isn't something that emerges within immersive journalism. It's rather an older phenomenon. Let's consider some examples. So during World War II, Martha Gellhorn, notorious American writer and journalist, considered to be one of the most prominent war reporters of the 20th century, calls her reporting of news and events the view from the ground. So this designation already suggests a feeling of immersion in itself. Breaking with journalistic practices of the time, it was then expected from war correspondents objective and immediate coverage. Martha Gellhorn provided coverage in a deepened and highly descriptive fashion, awakening a sensation of immersion, I would say, in her audience. Gellhorn's description by David appears to me as quite representative, and I quote, "Without fearing the dangers and risks she was taking, Gellhorn was looking to find out how war was changing people's everyday lives. She was visiting houses, hospitals, and prisons. She listened to stories, dreams, human tragedies. She wanted to show the weak and the oppressed, the unheard voices. Gellhorn is a storyteller that rebuilds the past and relieves the human tragedies of people that suffer from the consequences of war." Another example is Mr. George Plimpton, American writer and sports journalist who joined temporarily the football team Detroit Lions in the 60s. And with this experiment, Plimpton wanted to provide his readers with a greater insight as well as a more profound sensation about what really felt like being a player in that team. And Davidoff states, and I quote, "With his characteristic insight and wit, the Harvard-educated Plimpton recounts his experiences in successfully talking his way into training camp, not as a reporter, but as a player with the Detroit Lions, practicing with the team and actually taking snaps behind center in a preseason game." Okay, the last and another, I believe, relevant example involves journalist and CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, when in the late 50s he produced You Are There. It was a documentary show where real CBS journalists reported historical narratives as if they were happening and transmitted live on television. And in an article about Cronkite, one can read, and I quote, "No one had a voice like Walter Cronkite's, one that combined riveting drama and authority. You never tired of hearing it." Back in the 1950s, Cronkite, in addition to his news duties, hosted two absorbing TV series. One was called You Are There, and it reenacted significant events of the past. Only in this case, Cronkite would ask questions of the key players. One episode that sticks in my mind was his interview with Mary, Queen of Scots, before her execution. Sounds hockey, perhaps, but it worked. So, looking at the three previously mentioned examples, we might say that immersive journalism is somehow one of the most recent actors in the timeline of visual media, especially in what concerns the specific ways this visual media influenced journalism. The existence of a solid historical relation between journalism and the several forms of providing audiences with a greater sensation of immersion and presence in news is indisputable. This historical retrospective exercise is fundamental to understand the place of immersive journalism in the wider context of journalism and communication studies and practices. So, we can better comprehend its current dynamics as well as foresee its eventual and potential configurations. So, in a nutshell, and having as a background mindset the idea that today journalism, as we saw in the beginning of this presentation, is contextualized in an emotionally charged network environment, one could say that immersive media experiences are the result of a dynamic combination of immersion, presence, emotion, and other related concepts. Hence, Audience is key as it becomes participant of the story. The frontiers between journalist and audience sort of disappear as audience becomes actor in the news stories by being present within the news stories. Consequently, immersive media experiences are, I argue, eminently hyperpolysemic in the sense that immersive journalism takes further people's interpretation of the news. In other words, looking is doing, in the sense that audiences direct their own gaze. Because it is impossible to humans to see in 360 degrees, that would be really cool, but it's impossible. They must actively choose what to look at and when. Looking gives the audience, I would say, agency, not to change or affect the story, but to choose which pieces of the story they take in, make meaning out, and combine with other information to form a story in their minds. In this way, no two individuals experience the exact same story because no two individuals look at the exact same things in the exact same order. Thus, in this context, observing is an active state because it requires audience to construct their own interpretation of the immersive news stories, which ultimately entails, I would say, a certain degree of emotional involvement. So, to conclude, it seems quite undeniable that immersive journalism is a phenomenon that, by its inherent condition of innovation, deserves to be studied by the academia. The world of today is immersed in a truly digital ecosystem where, for instance, the so-called narrowcasting is a reality increasingly consolidated, where the consumption of news is something even more personalized and adapt to the needs, predispositions and individual emotional patterns. It is by considering this broad context, a context characterized by data-driven journalism, by the proliferation of visualization information, media business models created and oriented based on data sets, and by the platformization, I would say, of news, that I believe immersive journalism should be explored and thought over. Will immersive journalism become a truly empathy machine, as Milk suggests, that will connect people and news narratives in a unique way, a tool for the rehumanization of the media? I actually don't know. Or is it immersive journalism nothing more than the result of a technological, hyped lens, crazy times, that precisely by its eminently technical condition will stray in such a way from the journalistic practices that it could be incoherently called journalism? The aim of this presentation, which results from my early academic approach on immersive journalism, is to ignite responses to these and other critical questions. One of my takes is that it could be said that if the medium was the message in traditional journalism, the audience will necessarily have to be the message in immersive journalism. Thus, and according, for instance, to Latar and Norfor, immersive journalism could be considered as a phenomenon that in its very essence is defined by the relation between journalism and its audience, rather than being defined by its relations with the media it uses to communicate with the audience. On a final note, I'd like to emphasize that I consider that journalism needs to be accurate, credible, and most importantly, ethical. Journalism needs to give voice to the voiceless, to comfort the afflicted, and to afflict the comfortable. Storytelling in journalism should give people an insight, should teach people something, even if those stories challenge our existing beliefs. The internet and all things digital brought a wave of disruptions, a word I don't like very much particularly, but these disruptions sort of challenge every aspect of what we do. But with that wave of disruptions have come new opportunities and new story forms, including immersive journalism. But content is still king, obviously. By paper, by pixel, broadcast, broadband journalism needs to remain relevant in how it reaches and informs the diverse communities it aims to serve. And that is it. Vielen Dank. Thank you so much.